killed a man!
Looking back on it now, 2006 was a wild year being a kid in terms of what animated movies I got to see. You could either take that literally, or Happy Feet, or Flushed Away, Ice Age 2, Barnyard, and many more to realize that not only was this a year filled with many memorable titles that people still look back on pretty fondly, but it was also flooded with films starring a cast of animals in some shape or the other. Now granted, this is nothing unexpected from this medium, and definitely wasn't the first or last year where this would be the case, but still, like, you definitely got your furry fix this year. It was also this year that Sony Pictures decided to finally step into the ring in competing with literally every other animation studio that by this point has decided to fully switch over to 3D animation and release their first fully CG animated film, Open Season, which is a project by the dude who'd go on to produce the ultimate furry franchise. It's also starring Ashton Kutcher and Martin Lawrence alongside Gary Sinise and Deborah Messing, none of which would reprise their roles in the sequel 2 years later. Or the one after that. Or the one after. How are there 4 of these? Now, Sony Pictures Animation, to me personally, continues to be a very mixed bag. Some of the films I absolutely love, some of the films I cannot stand. Some of them very rightfully got turned into a successful franchise, some of them are the Emoji Movie. And you would assume that, especially their first film, wouldn't exactly be a cinematic masterpiece. I mean, we got companies like Pixar and Blue Sky who immediately hit the jackpot, but you can't expect a company's debut film to spawn an awesome franchise right off the bat. I personally remember liking the first 2 films quite a bit, but I was also a dumb kid, and I would take every nostalgic memory I have with a grain of salt. So how about we take a look back at Open Season to see if it was any good? The film revolves around the domesticated grizzly Boog, a kind, loving, yet also sheepish bear that tries to avoid any contact with the outside world. Similarly to Alex from Madagascar, his owner Beth likes to get him on stage to do a couple of tricks for the local citizens, and everything seems to be going well for him. Until he meets Elliot, an equally sheepish mule deer that was strapped onto the hood of a truck by resident madman Shaw. And after Elliot keeps on bugging Boog to do so, he decides to untie Elliot, which he sees as an excuse to further bug Boog at home. One delicious candy bar later, Boog got a literal taste for the outside world, and so the two of them break into the local supermarket and wreak havoc. For some reason in my mind, I always lump this scene together with Over the Hedge. Both have this weird obsession with close-ups of grocery store items that weirdly were a theme in other films coming out around this time too. Like Cloudy with a Chance of Meatballs the next year, and as a rounder boy myself, I found great enjoyment in those. I mean, I'm not anymore, but still, I wouldn't complain about a second sequel to that one. Beth finds out about their little escapade and sends Boog to his room, whilst Elliot has problems of his own, since Shaw has the tendency to develop an odd relationship with the animals he tries to capture, in the sense that his mindset is, if he can't have them, no one can. The resulting encounter with Elliot makes Boog go complete nuts, and so Beth finally decides to let him go. How they didn't notice Elliot came along with him I never really understood, but now the two of them are stuck together and need to find their way back home. Along the way, we already get a nice sense of the scenery this film sets up for itself. Along with the rather cartoony character designs, it makes for a pretty appealing look that shows some great usage of the new software the animators worked with. The animation itself looks a bit dated now, but the lighting and colors still look way better than I'd expected going back to this film. It's not amazing or anything, but just as a reminder, this is what Animal Logic's animation studio debut graced us with the same year. Are your feet happy yet? As you'd expect from a film like this, Boog and Elliot make their way through the woods, and along the way meet a bunch of other colorful animals such as some Scottish squirrels, mean-spirited beavers, Sonic, a couple of skunks, and these ducks that have by far the most tragic backstory in the film that I would address if the movie didn't take it even the least bit seriously either, so why should I? Soon the two realize that they've been walking in circles this whole time, and as Boog therefore decides to head off on his own, he causes the dam to break and flood the entire valley, taking Shaw along with them. Now if Boog wasn't already mad before, now he'd be really mad at Elliot, even though really it was his own fault to flood the dam, but that's just me. We get a rather forced emotional moment, I guess, where most of the animals turn their back on Elliot for no real reason, and Boog comes across a little cabin that he assumes to be the civilization he so desperately needed, even though, surprise, it was actually Shaw's house. And considering it's now officially open season, there's no one to stop him from trying to add Boog to his collection of dead animals up on the wall. all. My grandpa used to be a hunter too. I don't remember if he had a house that looked exactly like this, but it really adds an extra touch of insane to your domain. Luckily, Boog barely manages to escape this insane asylum and realizes that he probably won't make it back home by himself after all. Up next comes the obligatory duel between animals and humans that is pretty well coordinated at times, but nothing really out of the ordinary. One cool thing about it is when Shaw uses Boog's old bear plushie to play the song he used to get lulled to sleep with by Beth to haunt him amidst all the chaos on the battlefield. I like how Boog has to sort of reorient himself for a second and everything is in slow-mo, only for Shaw to break the tension and point the gun at him. Something about the way they use the music here is pretty neat, whereas the rest of the songs in the film aren't exactly noteworthy.
This is my song, I'll sing it now.
So, if you haven't guessed already, the animals manage to defeat Shaw, and in deciding whether Boog wants to go back home with Bev, of course he chooses his new family instead and everyone is happy, thus concluding open season. And man, if it wasn't for the nostalgia of it, I'm not really sure if I would like this movie as much as I once did, and still do to some extent. Surprisingly though, I'd argue that Sony actually cared about what they were making here. I expected open season to be a cringe fest of the highest caliber, but while some jokes don't exactly scream hours of thought spent on them, I never felt like they were just after the money, especially in terms of the dialogues, animation and characters. Cause while Elliot and Boog aren't the most original duo in the world, they also go through a lot together and seem far more relatable than I could say about some other films in Sony's library. And thanks to how many they already came up with in this first film and a decent chunk of profit made, there was nothing stopping them from working on the sequel already. That would then be dumped onto DVD without the original voice cast and straight up awful animation at times. Say what you will about the guys that took over for the main characters though, you gotta give the dude props who was replacing Kutcher. He seems way more into the role than his predecessor ever was. If you never watched these sequels, I wouldn't blame you. They did an abysmal job at promoting the later ones, especially the Halloween one, which I didn't even know about until recently, because if I did, you know I would have made a separate video on it last month. The second film sees the animals having to rescue Mr. Weenie from the clutches of an evil poodle, alongside some other new pets, whilst Elliot has to face the struggles of getting married. Now I'ma be real here, I always preferred this film over the first part, mostly because the jokes in this one are way better, and while the animation or plot are far below average, considering how proud the guys that made this one seemed of the sequel, it makes it somewhat hard to riff on it. I also enjoy many of the new characters they introduced, like this cat named Roger that forgets he's going on this animal vacation each year, so the other one has to explain what's going on to him every time. And Elliot seems far more likable as well, since the situation he finds himself in is one that makes sense for him to be stressed out by, and he learns from his mistakes in the end to some degree. It's decent. But the third part? That's a whole new can of worms. In this one, Boog wants to go on a guy's trip together with Elliot, who can't go anymore because of his new family with Giselle. Boog therefore storms off alone, only to be greeted by a circus, where for the first time ever he meets another grizzly named Doug, who desperately wants to escape the circus, and so in trying to get away for a while, Boog agrees to switch places. Little does he know that Doug isn't actually willing to let go of his new life, and so the both of them now have to prove their worth as their counterpart, while the pets from the second film and later on all the forest animals decide to try and rescue Boog. This movie is just straight up awful. None of the new characters they introduce are all that memorable. Elliot's kids are unlikable. They recycle a lot of jokes from the previous films and still manage to be less funny. Elliot got dumbed down even further to the point where it's unbearable to watch, and the film ends on a bare butt. It was enough to convince DreamWorks to have their animals go to the circus as well a few years later though. That Halloween sequel I was talking about earlier, however, I have no clue how it happened, but pressing the reset button to bring back Shaw and remove Elliot's kids really helped breathing new life into this franchise. Ironically, the film is far less cringeworthy, the animation is really great at times, it does a good job at poking fun at different horror movie tropes, and is very creative all around. There's this one scene where all the skunks gather around to form a skeleton out of their bodies meant to scare Shaw off that I liked. Mr. Weenie has a musical number with a pretty creative use of color for these films. There's this one dream sequence where Boog thinks that he's finally home with Bev when it was actually a werewolf, and they finally made good use of his name.
Are you trying to scare me? I was trying to say your name, but you jumped before I got to the gun.
Now I'm not too certain if we'll ever see any more of these movies, but if they should turn out anywhere near as good as this one, I'd be happy to see them return to theaters, because they clearly had something going for them. In fact, I'm surprised they didn't just turn this into a TV series. We already got one for Cloudy with a Chance of Meatballs and Hotel Transylvania, when this one's got everything a kid could ask for. Funny animals, fart jokes, cliche pop song sprinkled in there, and making fun of French people for no discernible reason. But if you're like me and grew up loving this movie, playing the video game on end, and replaying that scene where Elliot threw those rabbits at Boog's window, you know that there's a certain charm to these films that can't truly be emulated, because no one would want to. Open Season will go down in history as yet another CG animated animal body film, and I'm completely fine with that.
I really enjoyed it, and this is something that I'm really proud to be a part of.